doesn't that then obviously mean that what we're talking about here, when we talk about the scriptures being self-authenticating, is the actual scriptures that God gave? That's why we want to know what was written by Paul and John and Luke and not by a scribe 500 years later? Yeah.
Now, Matthew, he's the most difficult, I think, and I don't really know what's going on there. I think because the early church was unanimous that Matthew was the author, I think that lends great probability that Matthew played a large role in the penning of that gospel. But it's really difficult to, I mean, there are some challenges because Papias, that same author, the first one who talks about the traditional authorship of the Gospels, he's probably writing in the first decade of the 2nd century or around that time. He says that Matthew was originally written in Hebrew or Aramaic. And people who are real experts in the Greek language, people like Dan Wallace, people like D.A. Carson, they will say that the Gospel of Matthew is not translation Greek. It doesn't read. The Greek in it is not the kind of Greek that we would expect if they were translating it from Aramaic or Hebrew into Greek. And in fact, Carson and Moo in their New Testament introduction go as far as to say, Papias, they conclude that Papias was just simply wrong to say that Matthew was written originally in Hebrew or Aramaic. Well, Wallace comes back and he says, at least I don't think he's got it in print, but he's told me this, that one thing that he thinks is possible is, you've got these 5 discourses of Jesus in the Gospel of Matthew, like the Sermon on the Mount, the Olivet Discourse, and that perhaps what Papias is referring to, because he's talking about the Logia tu Jesu, the sayings or teachings of Jesus, it could mean that Papias was referring to a couple of these discourses of Jesus, that these were originally written in Hebrew or Aramaic. They got translated into Greek, and then an editor, perhaps under the supervision of Matthew, took these, then combined it with a lot of material from Mark that he used as his primary source, and then also some special other sources, what they would call the special M source. And that's the Gospel of Matthew that we have today. That makes sense to me. Mm-hmm. Some have even said it might even be Q, that Matthew wrote Q, and that's what Papias was referring to.
Of course, by saying that Matthew or anyone else is the author, it doesn't mean they sat down and wrote every word. It could mean they were the editor or the main source.
Sure, absolutely. I mean, gosh, you got Paul in Corinthians, and you say, there's co-authorship there, he and Sosthenes. Or you've got Romans, the crown jewel of Paul's writings. And in chapter 16, verse 22, it says, I, Tertius, who write this letter, send you my greetings. Well, he's obviously the scribe, but given Paul's writing style and his other undisputed letters, it would appear that Tertius probably did some really nice editing and crafting that letter together.
I think it's very possible that Matthew wrote his gospel first, but it's not the gospel of Matthew we have today, because Papias says that Matthew wrote his gospel in Aramaic or Hebrew. So I think it's possible that Matthew wrote the gospel in Aramaic, and then later on, it was a smaller one than what we have. Later on, someone came along, translated it into Greek, and then took stuff from Mark, and then maybe some other stuff from other sources, combined it, and that's the Matthew we have today.
I really vexed my kids in the class. Why can't I get where I'm going? Here it is, John Ankerbert.
One account that puts guards at the tomb. Were there guards at the tomb?
Well, now this is a question that I think is probably best left out of the program. This is a question that I think is probably best left out of the program because the vast majority of New Testament scholars would regard Matthew's tomb story or guard story as unhistorical. I can hardly think of anybody who would defend the historicity of the guard at the tomb story.
I would, but I'm an idiot.
Matter two. One is because it's only found in Matthew. And it seems very odd that if there were a Roman guard or even a Jewish guard at the tomb, that Mark wouldn't know about it and there wouldn't be any mention of it. The other reason is that nobody seemed to understand Jesus' resurrection predictions. The disciples, who heard them most often, had not an inkling of what he meant. And yet somehow the Jewish authorities were supposed to have heard of these predictions and understood them so well that they were able to set a guard around the tomb. And again, that doesn't seem to make sense. So most scholars regard the guard at the tomb story as a legend or a Matthean invention that isn't really historical. Most scholars regard the guard at the tomb story as a legend or a Matthean invention that isn't really historical. Fortunately, this is of little significance for the empty tomb of Jesus, because the guard was mainly employed in Christian apologetics to disprove the conspiracy theory that the disciples stole the body.